Hello, good evening, YouTube, and welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. Tonight, it's debate night, except instead of having more of a blood sports sort of debate, I'm joined by Liberty Lockdown to more kind of discuss our different worldviews, because I'm basically a neocon, and he's basically, you would call yourself an anarcho-capitalist. Is that right, Liberty?
Yeah, either way, man. By the way, it's Clint, so you can call me Clint if you prefer. But yeah, libertarian or anarcho-capitalist is either way is fine.
Okay. Yeah, well, there you go. So obviously we have a lot of differences and whatnot, but hopefully tonight we can kind of discuss some of our different worldviews, maybe find some common ground where possible, and kind of just talk, in a way that, unlike the recent debates that I've done, which have been, pretty confrontational. Though I will say, the last anarcho-capitalist I debated, Keith, he was really cordial and polite and professional and everything. So far from your side, you guys have had some really good debaters. The Kyle guy that debated me the other night was not an anarcho-capitalist. He was more of a griper. So,
Okay. Well,
yeah.
honestly, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to maintain my cool as well as Keith did, but I'm going to do my damnedest. So
Okay.
Forgive me if I
Yeah.
lose my temper at all. It's I really am passionate about these ideas, as you are. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, that's why it gets difficult, because we're both really political. We both feel really strongly about our views, and we have a lot of differences. But before we kind of get into it, if you could just kind of, I guess, tell the audience a bit about yourself, because like people know who I am and everything, and where they can find you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. My name's Clint, Liberty Lockdown Podcast at Liberty Lock Pod on Twitter, Liberty Lockdown on YouTube, everywhere else. So anyways, I am a 38-year-old quasi-retired real estate investor and mortgage broker, longtime libertarian, recent convert to anarcho-capitalism, and just very passionate about ending the lockdowns, hence the name of my show. I began it in May. It's already doing really well. So obviously there's a huge amount of demand for people that are equally pissed off about the lockdowns. So that's what people know me for, and I look forward to this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. I mean, that's something that we could discuss, is a bit about the lockdown situation, because for me, I've got criticisms in terms of how the government's kind of, taken a more, I don't necessarily want to use the term authoritarian, but in the technical sense of it, a more authoritarian direction in it as the pandemic's gone on. I'm kind of the view that if you're going to do that, you need to do it at the start. But I'm not somebody who just, straight up says that the government should basically do what they've been doing in China or anything. But I do think that government restrictions on social interaction, on business operation stuff is appropriate in a pandemic such as this. But what's your view around the lockdown, and to what sort of extent do you think there should have been government, intervention in society to prevent the spread of the virus?
Well, I don't think you're going to be surprised by my answer, but as an anarcho-capitalist, I believe the government had essentially no role in this. Obviously, I would prefer that the government not exist. So we're probably not going to see eye to eye on this topic at all. But as for the actual severity of the virus and the reaction that unfolded after the fact, I think that even a statist would be able to evaluate this at this point and say this was an overreaction, and that ultimately we have been led by a bunch of very dangerous people down a path of what I view as a very ascientifical process, utilizing lockdowns which have never been used in the history of the world, globally. This is a very, very unorthodox methodology, and one that I strongly oppose. I am curious to ask, though, given your kind of belief in the morality or I think you used the term superiority of the American government.
Yeah.
Why is it that where do you draw the line when you start to question the American government?
Well, I think that that there's always a place for constructive criticism, but I think that it varies in terms of how much of a crisis you're in or how much of a war you're in. So, for example, I think that criticism of the government in peacetime, or in and not as severe a war as, say, World War II, is less of an issue than criticism of the government if you're in, say, a total war or something, like if it's the Third World War, World War II, or whatever. I think so. In that sense, I think that there's a difference between, crisis mode versus standard peacetime in that sense. But
can I interrupt you just briefly?
Yeah.
You said during peacetime. I don't view us having peacetime in my life. So are you saying basically only when we have large scale declared wars, these skirmishes and whatnot that we've been in for my entire life, you would say that we are able to critique them during those, correct? Or no?
Critique them, absolutely. Do what Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning did? No. But to be critical of the war or outright just oppose the war effort, that's your free speech, right? Like my issue is if it compromises national security. The extent of wars that have gone on, say in the last 20 years, the largest one that the United States has been involved in was the war in Iraq. That was by no means a total war from the American side. When I say that, I'm talking more like, great power versus great power conflict. So as far as like where does criticism of the government, the U.S. government, become inappropriate, I would say under the most dire of circumstances, sometimes you do need to have trust in the government to guide things, such as the Third World War, or say if this virus had been like a plague or something, where say it had like a 30% kill rate or something, or a 50% kill rate.
Given how minor it was, why are you not more vocally opposed to the lockdowns? I mean, it does seem as if, especially at this point, we can all reflect on the actual fatality rates and conclude that this is a dramatic totalitarian response. Well, you may not describe it as totalitarian. I would, but do you still think that it was justified even after knowing everything we know now?
Well, I think that we need to differentiate between different governments' approach. I think that the United States government's response to COVID in the beginning was far too little, in my view. And as time has gone on, it's become somewhat onerous, and it's too late to really do too much of a difference at this point. And so at some point when the virus is already so penetrated into your country, there's only so much that you can do. However, you can still mitigate the spread of it. And I think that one reason why we look at it and say, well, the death rate of it is, between 1% and 5%, depending on what you look at, it does miss the point that if we compare it to what it would have been without any government intervention, it definitely would have been higher. And so when we say, well, it would be kind of the same as saying, like, you built up a huge dam and everything for flooding, and then the flooding happened, and the flooding only caused a little bit of damage, and then you say, oh, well, I guess we shouldn't have wasted all that money on building this dam or these dikes because the flood didn't do that much damage, without realizing that if you didn't have those dikes, it would have done a tremendous amount of damage. That's kind of the point there. But I'm not 100% in favor of all the measures that have been taken, and there's a lot of corruption on both sides and a lot of disgrace on both sides with the lockdowns. And
well, I think it's an interesting analogy, given that the type of excuses made when we have budgetary overruns. Same with the military-industrial complex, the wars that you largely support. Oftentimes, no matter how bad it is, the answer is always, well, you don't know how bad it would have been had we not. And it's like, these are unprovable assertions or non-disprovable assertions, I guess. So it's like, certainly with the virus, you could argue that it may have saved some lives. I think that you could also argue, in fact, I could prove that there have been many lives lost by the lockdown protocols that, drove people towards alcoholism and suicide and all sorts of other, knock-on effects from them. So I don't know. From my vantage point, I think that's really what I wanted to get to the bottom of, is like, okay, which aspect of the Bill of Rights like allows a lockdown in your view, or do you guys not believe in the Bill of Rights? I really don't know. Well,
you need to obviously be flexible enough to adjust to crisis situations. It's the sort of thing, Machiavelli said that, in a time of crisis, a dictatorship that's not able to think like a democrat will be overthrown, and a democracy that's not able to think like a dictator won't survive the crisis. And so you do need to be some have some degree of flexibility when you're facing a once in a century type pandemic. Now, you did mention earlier on in your sort of introductory statements, you had mentioned that there was no historical precedent to these types of lockdowns, and it's true in the sense of the business curtailment, this sort of stuff. However, there were analogous lockdowns, albeit centuries ago. So different policies and stuff that were tried in London, for example, during the plague of, I believe it was it was either 1665, 1666 or something, as well as when the Black Death went through what is now Italy. Back then was a cluster of city-states. There were city-states that had just straight up closed their borders. Like, they didn't let people in, and they tended to have about a 40% death rate compared to an 80% death rate in places that they just didn't do anything or they responded too late. So there is historical precedent of authoritarian responses to this.
Well, let me clarify then, because all I was saying was that we haven't had a global lockdown response. That's never happened, where you had almost every country on Earth have some form of lockdown. So this is very unique in that regard. But anyways, we don't have to harp on the lockdowns that much. I think that there's deeper stuff we can get into.
No, for sure. I would just say, I think one reason why that's kind of the case is that the Black Death took 30 years to make its way across all the nations, because trade and everything took forever back then. Whereas now, the last 50, 100 years is really the first time in history when a virus could spread everywhere in the world.
That's certainly true. Yeah, globalism has changed the game.
Yeah. So to kind of answer your question about like the Bill of Rights and everything, it's like, yes, like in theory, all this stuff is good. However, if you're so inflexible that you can't essentially take extraordinary means in times of extraordinary crisis, then you're not going to survive it. Now, I don't think the pandemic is necessarily as bad as it's been touted by some people. I've said it before, I could have been a lot worse. Like, I did a stream about a year ago a little less than a year ago, on the Red Death. This idea that eventually, if we don't do anything about China, one day something's going to come out of there that's going to have like a 30% death rate, like say an antibiotic resistant plague or something. And then, people are going to say, well, we were a bit harsh with the pandemic response before and everything, and maybe it's not going to be a big deal this time. And then like a ton of the world's going to die in the first couple months. But
certainly
I think
possible. That's the downside of doing lockdowns when you have a virus that isn't that severe, is that now if you have one that is, people won't take it seriously. But my counter argument to that would be that you don't really need to have lockdowns if you have a plague that's coming through, because people will respond accordingly. And you actually saw that in the first month, when lockdowns of businesses were not mandated. People were so concerned, many were already doing it, and they were requiring masks and social distancing and things of that nature. My belief is kind of a higher faith in humanity and their instinct for survival, that these people would have responded in a responsible manner to try and stay alive until they figured out, whether or not this thing was actually as dangerous as Fauci and others were advertising. I think in hindsight, many people feel duped and lied to. And I think that the knock-on effects from that are going to be very dire if we ever do have a moment of sincere crisis where people no longer trust the media, and they no longer trust the politicians. They no longer trust the scientists, for God's sakes. It's a very, it's a crisis.
Yeah, well, I think that that's definitely a part of it. Like I've said, I mean, the virus objectively is not as bad as a plague or anything. However, I do think it's the case that it could have been a lot worse if no government involvement had been taken. But one thing that you mentioned was that individuals will kind of like, they have this drive towards self-preservation and whatnot. And that's true. I think that the problem, though, is that as individuals, we can only do so much, and we only have so much access to information, and that there is a point when the government can come in and correct for externalities that emerge from that sort of issue, and actually have the best interests of society at heart, in a way that a society without a state wouldn't have a mechanism of that sort to kind of compel behavior in a sense that is in the interest of everybody, including those that feel that it's a waste of time or something. Because there are vulnerable people amongst us and stuff. But
certainly, and I think the vulnerable people would have been the first in line for quarantining themselves. But as far as externalities go, I mean, the externalities of lockdowns are profligate. They're everywhere. So it's an interesting argument. I personally disagree. I don't think that the government has a role in telling us how to live our lives, even in epidemic or pandemic type situations. But that's a real ride or die belief in the Bill of Rights that obviously we disagree on. So anyways, like I said, we really don't have to harp on the lockdowns. It's my bag, but I don't want to like occupy the entire time with it.
Oh no, I get that. We can talk about other stuff. It's kind of interesting because
Sure.
we didn't get to talking about that with the debate with Keith, for example. We talked more about foreign policy and everything, and
Right.
so this is kind of a new angle. But yeah,
that's actually one. Yeah, that's actually one other thing I wanted to bring up is that, and as I've DM'd you this as well, I think that Keith did a fairly good job. I know you disagree, and obviously as a debate opponent, you're going to probably disagree no matter what. But
yeah.
I think he did a pretty good job laying out kind of the historical case for why we are so anti-interventionism. So I would like to talk a little bit more about kind of the general philosophy and whether or not we have. I wouldn't say common ground, to be perfectly honest, but if we can understand each other better is kind of what I'm seeking to do.
Okay, sure, yeah, go for it.
So first off, I would like to know a little bit more about you, if you don't mind. And I don't know how private you are on your show. I've only seen the debate with Keith, just to be honest. So if you could give me a little bit of your background, because I gave you mine, so just so I know where we're coming from.
Yeah, sure. So basically, all this is public information. I'm a 27-year-old recent graduate at university, did a degree in economics, political science. I am basically I describe myself as a liberal neoconservative with offensive realist characteristics. So what that means essentially is that I believe in the preservation of the Enlightenment and the expansion of the Enlightenment, the West, as we see it, the Western project throughout the world. I'm a moral universalist. I run a meme page called Liberal Hawk Memes for Moral Universalist Teens. We got about 2,500 followers over there. And that's basically, the idea that, well, democracy doesn't just matter here. It's an inherent virtue that is morally superior throughout the world. In other words, if I'm born in the United States or if I'm born in the UK, I can recognize that the West is the best. But if I'm born in Russia or born in North Korea, I can also recognize that the West is the best and try my best to try to get out, the hell out of there, if possible. And we do have defectors and stuff that, you ask those defectors, where would you rather live, North Korea or America? They'd say, well, like they miss the food or they like having people that they can communicate with from North Korea. But if you ask them where would they rather be if you could speak the same language and, and all that, they'd rather have the rights that Americans have, basically. And so for me, kind of a bit about my background, I started YouTube shortly after graduating, and I've been making videos basically, for the most part, focused on interventionism, on national security issues, on international relations at large on a theoretical standpoint, and really trying to rather kind of snap people out of this idea that, well, you can support democracy, you can support human rights, you can support virtues in the West, but think that, well, but who are we to say that that's better than what they have in North Korea or Iran or whatever? Whereas for me, part of my project here is to try to say, yeah, we are the best and we should be proud of that. So that's a little bit about me. Is there anything else that you wanted to know?
Yeah, I would like to understand a bit of your political arc. I mean, everyone has their own evolution. I was lucky in that my dad was actually a libertarian. He ran for Congress in the 90s. So I got a very early indoctrination into this, and then I kind of did my own research and evolved towards anarcho-capitalism. It is odd. It is unusual to see someone in their 20s who is a neoconservative in my experience. So I'm genuinely curious how you came to these conclusions.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, I know some people might like say, oh, well, that's kind of like, oh, like take offense to it or whatever. It's like, no, it's true. I make that point on the show all the time. There aren't very many of us right now. It's a small thing. It's a niche thing in that sense right now.
I don't mean it as a slight to say that it's unusual. Yeah. I just don't encounter it very often.
Yeah, and it's like, and the thing is, like, to be fair too, even though there are more people on your side that are young, it's also kind of rare to be anarcho-capitalist.
Oh yeah, we're both tremendously minority ideologies. So there is no superiority coming off on this end. I realize that it's a niche product.
Yeah. So that's the thing. That's actually one of the areas, like, not common ground per se, but a bit of, we both are in an uphill battle in terms of our, worldview, because like, I don't see us as being interventionist enough. And I think it would be fair to say you regard Western foreign policy as too interventionist. Is that right?
Tremendously so. Yeah. And you're in Canada, correct?
Yeah, well, I live in Canada. That's right. I would ideally like to immigrate to the United States at some point in the future. That's what I'm looking at doing. I'm just clearing up debt and everything now from school first before I do any like big life moves like that. But sure. Ideally, I'd like to live in either Florida or Texas, because you can actually afford to retire in those places, for example. So
that is true. Well, I guess my question for you first off is, do you envision the same kind of hawkish mentality for the Canadian government, or is this strictly an American, hegemony?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because sometimes people say things like, "Oh, you just want the U.S. to do work for you," or whatever. It's like, no, I've been very clear. I want all NATO countries to spend what Reagan did, between 6% and 8% of GDP on the military. We have a problem with NATO where the U.S. is one of the only countries that actually pulls their weight, and they pay about 2.5%. In Canada right now, it's around 1%. It's really embarrassing. So, I mean, obviously, everybody knows Trudeau's the Prime Minister of Canada. I despise Justin Trudeau. I think, I don't talk about that as much because most of my audience is American, but Trudeau is a disgrace. He said that he admires the basic dictatorship of the Communist Party in China, for example. And so for me, my project is that I want Canada to become, a neocon sort of country. I want America to be. I want the UK to be. I want, Israel to be. I want Poland. Like all of us, we need to spend a lot more on defense. Poland actually, and Israel and the US all spend more than most of NATO, but for all of us, it's nowhere near what it was in the 1980s. And the way that I see it is we're in a Cold War against two powers now, whereas before we were in a Cold War just with the Soviet Union. Now we're in a Cold War with Russia and China, and we need to spend a lot to guarantee our security. And so all the policies that I advocate that the United States do, like I said, I'm a moral universalist. I don't discriminate. I want the exact same policies in Canada. I said it before, like if I was Prime Minister of Canada, we would be drilling a ton of oil. We would be getting rid of the carbon tax. We'd be increasing military spending to 8% of GDP. Now that'd take a while. It'd take a while, and we would be doing away with the welfare state and replacing it with a negative income tax. That's what I want for all Western countries, and I want to make the world the West. So,
well, I'll agree with you on getting rid of the income tax. I would question your moral universalist theology. I do not understand how that's any different from wanting global governance. I mean, are you still advocating for there to be separate nations, or are you looking for a single global governance?
Yeah, so basically what I kind of aim for is like a federation of democracies down the road where like all countries are democratic, but ideally way down the road, because the international system is an unstable equilibrium. I think that the ultimate steady state, the best equilibrium for the world would be that the United States of America just become the United States and have like Pakistan, have Uruguay just be states the same way that Montana and Florida are today. So like, one capital in Washington, D.C. So a lot of people say like, oh, you're a globalist. It's like, I'm not a neoliberal though. I want to get rid of the UN. I want the US to be like the world country basically. So.
Well, given the downsides to the UN, which you're obviously aware of, why would you have such faith that the American government would maintain the same principles that you intend to have implemented globally? I mean, do you not see the inherent risk in having a single global hegemon that can, just push their will on everybody?
Yeah, so the end state of humanity is for there to be a global hegemon. Like there will be a lot of wars going forward, but eventually it'll be resolved with one power that's actually a stable equilibrium. It might take 18,000 years, it might take 400 years. It really depends. But it's going to be.
Please lay out how you came to that conclusion real quick.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Why do you believe that? I don't see it as a natural conclusion.
So the world is anarchic. And I mean that on the international system level. So there's no world police. States are going to do what they're going to do. And if the bad guys go in and conquer a good country and enslave them and kill people and stuff. If nobody intervenes, they're going to get away with it. In other words, the world is like the Lord of the Flies. And so in that, states advance their own interests, and great power states advance their interest in ways that smaller power states would like to do, but they can't because they don't have the economic base to do so. They don't have the military base to do so. And so for all intents and purposes, you're going to have one of the great powers become, the unipolar hegemon, like the United States was more or less in the 1990s, but that's an unstable equilibrium in and of itself, because you can always have the emergence of new rivals, but eventually there will be another world war, and that's going to result in another big change to the international system. And I think it's going to result in the consolidation of power by the victor. And that will either be Russia, China, or the United States, basically. And I think that we're at a point where they're dead set on their ways and advancing their interests. Whereas for us, we've got a lot of people in our countries in the West that think that we're the bad guys, and they've got like guilt and everything, and defeatism and all that kind of stuff. And so right now, I think it's possible that unless we have a sea change in the political culture, that that it would be China that would just eventually subsume the world, or Russia down the road. But no matter what, until you have that world state, there's always going to be wars. It's always going to be unstable. So that's kind of the issue there. And so for me, recognizing that, and recognizing that even if I like a smaller country, like say that I like Luxembourg more than America, I can recognize that Luxembourg doesn't have the base, that they don't have the power to contend in that running. So for me, I root for the country that's closest to what I believe in to be the dominant power, and that's the United States. It doesn't mean I agree with the US government on everything, but I agree with them on more than China and Russia. And the US has a system that allows for self-improvement over time that communist China, fascist Russia just don't. So
what would you do to the countries that do not go along with your master plan?
Yeah, so we've got a lot right now. We got obviously Syria, we got Russia, we got China, we got North Korea, we got Iran.
Sorry, let me slow you down.
Yeah.
All of these countries are not going along with your master plan at this point. Pretty much every country on Earth, because your goal is to have a single global hegemon. So how, like, you're basically saying, I honestly this is going to sound mean, and I don't intend to, but I don't see a tremendous difference between what you're laying out from what Nazi Germany said. I mean, there's a level of moral certitude. There's global domination. We're going to have one global governance. Like yours isn't race-based per se, but it still seems as if that's what you're calling for is essentially a dominant military that takes over the entire planet. No?
Well, I would say that that's a false equivalence, because the Nazis were based on extermination of racial minorities and an empire-based system where the mother country ruled over everybody else. What I'm arguing for is a liberation system where the whole world becomes the U.S. with the same rights and privileges.
But if people don't want your view of liberation, what do you do with these people? I mean, you have other countries that are very proud to be what they are, and while you and I may disagree philosophically or even morally on what they want for themselves, I don't see how it's our place to basically bomb them into getting along, or getting in line with our belief system. So genuinely, I'm asking, like, what would you do to these countries that are not necessarily, it's not North Korea, it's not Syria. I don't know, some country that's in between, that you obviously isn't American, but also is not pure evil. Are you still calling for them to essentially, I don't know, overthrow their government, cede their power to the American Union of some sort? Like, what is the game plan, the end plan?
Yeah. So I think it's important to distinguish between the people and the regime. So obviously, say Syria, the Syrian people want human rights, they want freedom, they want their own, their own ability to be free in their own homes and stuff like that. Assad doesn't want to be a part of the world order. Assad has to go, basically. So to answer your question, there are two different means. So with great superpowers, great powers like China and Russia, war is not the solution. I talk about how it would actually be very easy to deal with China. All that you would do is, as a world, community, or even just as the US say, we're not trading with you anymore, you're done, we're going to take a really big financial hit, but you guys are cut off from trade, and the people would lose their jobs over there, and they would overthrow the communists within a year, and so they'd be done. You wouldn't have to do a nuclear war with them.
Isn't that exactly what we did with Japan, though, man? I mean, isn't that what brought about Pearl Harbor, is that we embargoed them?
Oh, well, it's very possible. I want to be clear here. It is possible that they don't respond to it, favorably, and they open fire on blockading vessels. The U.S. would win a war, though. Like, they know that, so they wouldn't make that move. If they did make that move,
if you're economically starving them, it's almost obligatory that they make that call. I mean, it's really, you're playing with fire. I mean, you're playing with fire with the nuclear power. I just think it's very reckless to think that you can embargo China, a nuclear power, and expect them to behave rationally. I mean,
right. So
it's a danger, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So China and the West are inevitably going to come into a military conflict if we don't destroy them economically. I'd rather have a small scale limited war with them, say in a year, than wait for them to initiate the war in, say, 60 years when they have, say, the same number of nukes. Right now, they don't have very many nukes, for example. So the U.S. would win a war with them right now. They would probably win a war with the U.S. in 60 years. So why do you think it's inevitable?
I'm curious. I really don't. I don't see it as inevitable.
Because the free world can't coexist with islands or continents of slavery. Like, we have islands of freedom in the world, and we have continents of slavery, and we can't have peaceful coexistence with them. They have imperial ambitions to, control the world, and America has ambitions that counter that. So
you're gonna absolutely hate this response, but and you're gonna call it moral relativism, but it's very challenging for me to hear you describe other countries as slave states when we have, I think, either the highest or the second highest per capita imprisonment rate in America. So, like, you support all the laws of America? Is the war on drugs, everything? You talked briefly about the war on drugs.
I support the war on drugs, yeah.
And I know that was based off of history with your father, which I don't want to get into because it's far too personal. But I am curious, given that there are plenty of examples where decriminalization has been tried after there was harsh prohibition, and you had decreasing rates of drug addiction. You had, far better responses from the addicts in those communities. Why is it that you still believe, we have 2 million people in prison in America, and we're the land of the free, allegedly? That rubs me the wrong way. It rubs many libertarians the wrong way. I do not understand how you justify that. So if you could lay out your case, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so it's not just because, like, my dad was a drug addict or anything. It's because I can recognize that drugs are moral drain on society, for example. I think that we can expect better from our government than just giving up and just letting society become, wrought with nihilism, all that kind of stuff. I think that what's clear is that, with the situation in the United States, I would regard it as moral relativism for sure, because you're comparing a system in communist China that's literally detaining millions of people based on their ethnicity, in terms of the Uyghurs, not to mention all the Han Chinese people that get disappeared in the night for being accused of being critical of the regime, for example, or guilt by association, that kind of stuff. Whereas in America, you've got a legitimate, recognized code of laws that's, obviously passed by elected representatives. And if you break those laws, even if you disagree with what the laws are, if you break the law, you're still going to be arrested for it. And so I think it's different. Now, you could say, well, I think that we should overturn what some of these laws are and everything. There's a legal process to do that in, but I wouldn't regard the U.S. prison system as slavery. Some people are wrongfully convicted. That's true. But people are also wrongfully convicted in China all the time on a much greater scale. So,
well, I would argue that moral degeneracy is putting in, non-violent people into prison. So why is it that just because someone has a lifestyle or makes a decision that you disagree with, which I would also disagree with — I am not a drug user, never have been. I just simply believe people should have their free will to make that own choice for themselves. And ultimately, also, I believe that, historically, we can demonstrate pretty definitively that you can deal with drug addiction in a much more holistic fashion than imprisoning people for life sometimes. So I don't know. Do you not believe that people should have the right to choose to do drugs. I mean, obviously, alcohol is legal. There's plenty of things that are legal that kill people all the time. Would you implement your morality to ban all of them?
Well, I can answer that. I do just have one quick question though, which is how does somebody who's a drug addict exercise liberty? Like how does being addicted to meth, for example, how do you exercise liberty when you're addicted to drugs? That's just my quick question, and then I can answer yours. So
sure. I mean, I think it is liberty to do drugs if you want to, and I've known plenty of cocaine addicts, meth addicts that had fairly functioning lifestyles. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people whose lives are completely ruined by drugs. That's a given. Of course there are. But I don't feel certain enough that, one, I'm a moral arbiter to tell everyone that they should live how I do. I think that's very dangerous. And two, give the state the power to imprison someone, throw them in the cage because they do something that I disagree with, that hasn't hurt anybody. Like why do you think that it's the state's responsibility to protect someone from themselves and put them in prison as opposed to let them languish in drug addiction in your worst case scenario or OD and die? I still think that it's a much more moral degeneracy viewpoint to think that you should cage them for decades.
Well, I think that by and large, I differentiate between the user, who in a way is a victim of drugs, versus the dealers. Like my focus is on getting rid of the dealers and punishing the dealers. I don't regard somebody who is addicted to drugs and needs to buy drugs. I don't regard them as like, some heinous villain in society. What I do regard as a heinous villain are those that propagate drug addiction and everything. So in particular, when we talk about it as a nonviolent crime, there's a difference between a nonviolent crime being a drug addict and needing to get your fix versus selling it. So for me, I consider selling drugs to be a violent crime. I don't consider buying drugs to be violent, but it is still criminal under the laws as they are right now. But no matter what we reform it to, I still think that selling this stuff should be illegal. And I think that you asked about the morality of it. I think that that's one of the ways that the government can come in and correct for the negative externalities of people not necessarily knowing what's best for them. And I want to live in a system where the government is looking out for, the people that it's responsible for. I think that that is one area where having a government is preferable to not having a government. Is that sort of, you could call it compassionate conservatism, whatnot, paternalism, that sort of thing. I think that there's a role there, as long as the government's not corrupt, not malicious or anything, there's a role there that the government can actually improve society by making calls that are in everybody's best interest. Because once you become addicted to drugs, you lose your liberty to make rational choices thereafter, right? Like you might have the freedom to make that choice to become addicted to it, but once you're addicted to drugs, you're no longer exercising liberty in a rational sense.
I have to disagree. I mean, there are plenty of addicts that kick their addictions. Did they not have liberty to do so?
Well, I think that it would be better had they not become addicted in the first place. That's kind of my view of it. I think that we can do better as a society than to just leave everybody be on their own to fend for themselves in that sense. And I'm a pretty free market guy compared to, obviously people on the left and stuff. But I do think that there's a place for a social safety net. That's why I support a negative income tax. And I think that there's a place for paternalism. That's why I support the government having higher standards than just allowing these kinds of things to ruin lives of the citizenry. So,
well, I'm going to have to push back against you saying that it ruins lives, because, or wanting to help people from having their lives ruined. You putting people behind bars for decades, labeling them felons, and then having them come out and not be able to get fucking work is definitely ruining some lives. So, do you actually care about the addicted, or is it more about keeping your society in an appearance or having the visage that you agree with?
Well, if you said to me, you don't think that people who buy drugs should go to jail, that'd be an interesting conversation, and I'm open to that. I don't have a firm stance on that one way or another, because I can see how
there's some common ground.
But I think that selling drugs, that's my issue primarily. Okay. Like if a drug addict buys drugs, I don't think they should go to jail for life. I don't think they should go to jail for very long. However, I can understand the argument saying, well, if you make it okay to buy drugs, then who are you to say that it's illegal to sell drugs, just from a, hypocrisy stance, that sort of thing. I do think they're really different issues, but I know people like Ben Shapiro would make that argument where they'd say, well, if it's okay to buy them, why shouldn't it then be okay to sell them? And obviously I don't regard it as okay to sell it. So
right. Well, as a free market, capitalist, I do believe that it should be legal to sell drugs, and I don't think that prohibition works. So I strongly oppose it on many levels. I think that it doesn't help people. I think it ruins lives, and I think that ultimately, neither you or I are the moral arbiter. If someone isn't hurting someone else, I don't feel as if I can cage them. Period. And I just think that it takes a level of hubris, to be honest, to feel that way, to feel that you can imprison someone for doing something that isn't hurting anybody but themselves. It's like suicide laws. It's like you just shouldn't be. Well, first off, I mean, obviously, if someone kills themselves, you can't really enforce it. But there have been laws against suicide. I think it's nonsense. Like, people should have the right to take their own lives. They should have the right to become drug addicts. But if that drug addiction gets into an area in which they hurt the community in terms of theft or driving drunk and killing somebody, things of that nature, certainly you have to have mechanisms to remove them from society, at least for a time. But I do not, and I'm glad to hear, honestly, I'm glad to hear that you could, come a little bit to my side on perhaps not imprisoning people that are just simple drug users if they are nonviolent. I think that that's a step in the right direction. So anyways, we can move on to the next topic.
I just had one other question, though, which is that when you mentioned how they're hurting nobody but themselves, my focus is on the drug dealers. I don't regard selling, say, meth and that kind of stuff as nonviolent. I think that, there are people that can do that recreationally, and it's not really that much of an issue for them. But then that they're also selling it to people where that's going to ruin their kids' lives. There are other people like in other words, you have to bear in mind the moral effects of what you do in each of your actions, and that there's an effect to selling drugs that can trickle down and ruin a lot of people, and you don't know which way it's going to go. And so I do think that there's a moral culpability there, where I don't regard that as a nonviolent action. I actually regard it as inherently violent in terms of the effect that it has. It's not the same as like punching somebody, but it's...
Well, if you're gonna run with that line of reasoning, you have to support imprisoning bartenders, liquor store owners, all the way down the line, because way more people die from alcohol than they do from many drugs. You have to imprison people who get addicted to prescription drugs. I mean, there are tons and tons of drugs in society that kill people and ruin lives all the time. So the arbitrary line where you say, yeah, this drug dealer who sells coke has to go to prison for life, whereas this guy who sells or prescribes OxyContin to people whose lives also get ruined from it, they get $250,000 salaries and vacations in the Bahamas. I think it's a fucked up, way of thinking personally. And I don't like having arbitrary lines when it comes to imprisoning people. Like, it needs to be very consistent. And I think that the consistent stance, if you want to take it, is to say that anyone doing any drug that hurts them has to go to prison, or not the person doing it, but anyone selling any drug that hurts anybody has to go to prison. And I hope that you wouldn't make that argument. I think that the more rational, logical conclusion is to say that people need to make their own choices. And as a community, we need to lift up those that are drug addicted and riddled with addiction, as opposed to imprisoning them. But that's, utopic, if you want to call it that. Maybe one day.
Yeah, I would say again that there's definitely a difference between, say, selling drugs on the black market versus prescribing things from a medicinal standpoint. I do think that is a bit of a false equivalency there. I think that there is still a difference, and I think that just because you can't address every problem in society doesn't mean you can't do some good, and that you can't get rid of some problems. And so I think, alcohol.
You and I both know how many people die from cigarettes and alcohol, though, right? I mean,
yeah, no, I'm well aware of that. I think cigarettes, especially, that there's a better case to be made there for more strict government intervention on that. But I would say, especially in terms of the effect that it has on other people as well, I think that you can make a very similar argument. But I would say, given with the way that the political culture is right now, it's easier to keep things illegal than it is to make things illegal. And if we can at least prevent the scourge of things like meth addiction and that kind of stuff, why not at least settle for that? That's my kind of view. Why not make some good, even if you can't make everything better?
Because the people that are in prison that are nonviolent drug offenders do not agree that you're making things better, and those people matter too. So that kind of was my question as to is this an actual concern for the drug addict, or is this just about molding society into an image that you advocate for? And I think that it's more utopic to believe that you can imprison people that have different lifestyles from you to have a society which you would prefer to live in. I don't enjoy having drug addicts or homeless people around me either. That is a serious societal issue, but I would much rather find ways to assist them as opposed to imprison them. And I think that is to circle back to why I think it's very hard to say that China is a slave state and we're a free state. You can't have 2 million plus people in prison and call yourself a free state. I'm sorry, you just can't. Now, I'm not saying we're the same. I'm not saying we're even close to the same, but I think it's very far-fetched to still describe America as a free state, given the amount of people that are in prison right now that haven't hurt anybody, man. Like, these people haven't hurt anybody. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional, but it fucks me up. It fucks me up to think about how many non-violent drug offenders are in prison forever, and they've been there forever, and their kids are at home. You want to talk about societal good? Like, what about the damage that comes from these non-violent people that are in prison that can't raise their kids? I know you care about culture. Do you not care about them raising their kids? Like, this is right. So it goes deep, man.
So if we did things my way, though, there would be no drug addicts down the road, and society would be infinitely better off in that sense. And so you talked about it as being an image and this kind of thing, but no, if we did things my way in 50 years, this wouldn't be an issue anymore. We would have a more productive and healthy society. That's
a fascinating perspective. You think that people would ever stop doing drugs just because you criminalize it so aggressively? I mean, you have drug use all over the planet. I mean, prohibition simply does not work. We have more people addicted today than we did, 50 years ago, and it's not even close. So I'm stunned. I'm stunned to hear you say that. I'm stunned to think that you believe. Is it sincere? You honestly believe that 50 to 75 years from now, if given your druthers, that we could have no drug addiction in the world?
Well, not in the world. I'm just talking about the United States. If we had, neocons for 75 years in the U.S. with a consistent policy that went hard after drug dealers and really focused on, getting rid of the nihilism and actually building, this sense of community and everything in society. And, we actually, made a real effort to...
Have we not made a real effort to end the war on, to win the war on drugs? You really think that it has been lackluster?
Well, it's been nominal. It's targeted the drugs and stuff. It hasn't taken into account economic conditions. It hasn't taken into account culture. It hasn't taken into account a lot of the things that give rise to drug addiction. I want a more holistic approach to it than simply just going after drug dealers. But I do want to go after drug dealers. But I also want to try to solve the problems for why people get into that in the first place, right? So, that's kind of what I'm focused on. But I would say... I would push back on the line about how you can't call a country a free society if there are 2 million people in prison, because in the United States, obviously, there's only about a fifth as many people as in China. And what if, for example, all those 2 million people had done violent crimes and they happen to be convicted and locked up? I think you could still call a country a free country if 2 million people are there, if they rightfully belong in prison. And so I do think
over half of them are nonviolent, though. So we should acknowledge that. And if you have 1 million people that are in prison that are nonviolent, I don't think you can describe it as a free state. We can agree to disagree on this, but I really strongly believe that if you want to call America, the moral arbiter and have the entire globe model our governance, you really need to get this ironed out. Because nonviolent people, especially given your background, man, I'm honestly surprised that you're not more sympathetic to the addict. To the fact that these people are put away forever for not hurting anybody but themselves. Now, again, I totally believe in having laws where a drug addicted person hurts someone else, violently. But if they're just a drug addict who's struggling to survive but still making it, and then they get hit in some sting operation and they spend the next 20 years of their life in prison. It's fucked up. I mean, it is a complete atrocity. And I'm just, I don't know. I hope you'll give it further thought.
Well,
I really do.
I gotta ask you a question though, Clint, which is that, look, I'm not saying that we should imprison people for simply being addicted to drugs, but you do understand, like you have to understand that they do create a demand for the drug dealers to operate. In other words, if there was nobody buying the drugs, they wouldn't be able to operate. That's the argument for the prison approach, to basically say we have a zero tolerance on this sort of thing. But I would say, though, I would say additionally, when you talked about how, well, about 50% are nonviolent, you're also including drug dealers in that. And I don't regard drug dealers as nonviolent. And I really do think that, you know, if the laws are what they are, you can change them through the legal process, but the laws are still on the books. In other words, just because I disagree with what a law is doesn't mean that that gives me carte blanche to go and break it. It's kind of the same thing with Edward Snowden. You can make the argument that Edward Snowden really felt that he was, you know, doing the right thing or whatever, but it's not his place, and he still violated and infringed upon national security, especially in the case of Chelsea Manning, where it's like, I mean, even if they genuinely believed they were doing the right thing, that's not their prerogative. They need to follow the law still. So
there was a time in which it was illegal to, you know, free slaves. So were those people wrong to do so?
Well, I would say that that's a bit of a false equivalence, because I regard slavery as an ill on society, the same way that I do with meth and whatnot. So it is a bit different in that case. So,
brother, I'm not saying it's the same thing, but it's pretty similar. I mean, you have people that are imprisoned. They work for pennies right now for being nonviolent drug offenders, and you have people that basically worked for room and board and were whipped if they didn't work fast enough, and it was illegal to help them get free. I think that if you're going to talk about morality and you're going to talk about following the law, it's really important that you consider all of the historical examples of absolute atrocities that were law. And I don't want to go back to Nazi Germany, but the prison guards were doing their job, man. You know, they were following the law. Like, this is a really fucked up way of looking at the world, to think that it's okay to look the other way when people are being enslaved simply because it was the law at the time. You know?
Well, no, I'm not making that argument. I regard the laws of Nazi Germany as illegitimate. I don't recognize their sovereignty or anything. I do recognize the sovereignty of the American government. I do consider the laws of the American government to be legitimate. So in the
1800s, were they legitimate?
Slavery was not legitimate, no, and the Confederacy was illegitimate. But the United States today, in this year, again, I don't think that you can compare it to slavery. I think that makes light of slavery, personally, and
I think it makes light of people being put in prison for 30 years. I mean,
well, they broke the law, Clint. Like, if you do break the law, and the laws are on the books, it's like, well,
they broke an arbitrary law that you decided, not that I decided.
But it's not arbitrary.
It is arbitrary. It's absolutely arbitrary. Whether or not you're addicted to cocaine or you're addicted to Oxycontin, one, you're allowed to function in society, and if you're addicted to the other, you spend your entire life in prison. How is that not arbitrary?
Well, one was prescribed by a medical professional. The other is you're giving
cocaine
money.
Used to be prescribed by medical professionals too, brother. Come on.
Yeah, but I'm saying that there's a difference between a trained medical doctor that's literally spent the majority of their life studying the medical field and everything, prescribing something that might have some harmful side effects to a patient, versus drug addiction. And I actually regard...
They used to prescribe cocaine, brother.
Yeah, but again, it's a different if a doctor does it versus, and also they had bad technology back then, like technology advances. So I think that these anachronisms, this kind of stuff doesn't necessarily work. But I would say that I regard actually inducing people to become addicted to drugs is comparable to slavery in some sense. I'm not saying it's the same thing or anything. I'm just saying if you sell drugs and you ruin lives and you get like dads addicted to drugs and stuff like that, and now they can't exercise their liberty or anything, well, it's kind of like you've just stolen people's autonomy and their agency and everything. And so
you better be imprisoning the CEOs of big pharma. I mean, I don't know that there's been more lives from the cartel or from big pharma, but it's pretty fucking close. So I think it's an interesting argument. I totally disagree. I don't think that either are immoral, but I think that having an arbitrary line is immoral, because you have people that are functioning in the black market, which are giving a product that there's demand for to people that want it. And then you have doctors, sure, but you have prescription mills that are just shitting out prescriptions for drug addicts all day, every day. It happened all through the all over the past 20 years with the Oxycontin stuff. So I think that the line is arbitrary, and for that, I cannot get on board. But regardless, I think that it's sad to me to hear that you think that a law that exists in modern America is just instantly just. I just simply disagree.
Well, you can overturn laws, though. What I'm saying is that the system is just, and that if you don't like a law, you can lobby to have it removed through the democratic process. I don't think that you should, though, just break the law because you say that a law is unjust. I still think that that demonstrates criminal behavior. What it really demonstrates is it demonstrates an inability to abide by the social contract that we have as a society. And it goes to a broader disregard for the laws and the state and our society as a whole. And that if we just tolerate people basically saying, well, I'm not going to recognize the sovereignty of the government here, I'm going to do my own thing. Well, in aggregate, that's a huge problem, and we can't tolerate that. That's what I would say there. And so even if somebody breaks a law that I don't think should be on the books, I can still see why the court's going to take it as a serious crime, because if you just say, well, I don't agree with this law, it's like, okay, but by that logic, a pedophile could say, yeah, I touched a kid, but I don't believe that pedophilia should be illegal. It's like, yeah, but that's not your place to say. If you don't think it's...
But there's a victim there, man.
The government. Yeah, but there's a victim in selling drugs, though. There's a victim in both cases. I
don't agree. I don't agree.
Well, I do believe so. So we will just have to agree to disagree there. I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. So we can move on to the next topic. So
sure.
I want to get to.
Well, I guess you're obviously a big fan of our defense industrial complex. Yeah. I'm curious: is there any other industry that exists at all that you believe functions better with a monopoly?
Functions better with a monopoly. Well, I think that, Alfred Marshall back in the day, he talked about how in the early 20th century, he basically talked about the corporate life cycles, and he talked about how in particular industries, there are industries that naturally tend towards a monopoly, such that trying to keep the market free isn't going to work because of, the natural barriers to entry and stuff. He talked about, utilities and whatnot, and that there's a case to be made there that in order to reduce deadweight loss to society, the government is better off to actually recognize that one of those firms is going to be a monopoly, but that with that privilege comes the responsibility that you basically have to treat everybody fairly. You can't not sell electricity to somebody just because they disagree with your company, that kind of thing. And so there are other sectors for sure that work that not only do they work better as a monopoly, but that if you leave the free market to do its thing, it will reach a stable equilibrium, which is a monopoly. And that's true in a lot of more local what you call it, mining type operation. It's true in power production. Oftentimes it can even be true in tech sectors, for example, that there are sectors in the economy that just happen to tend towards monopolies because they're characterized generally by very high barriers to entry, few players, and the sort of volatility where eventually there's going to be a monopolist that emerges. And at that point, you're better off saying, okay, well, there's going to be a monopoly here, but they're going to have to follow some rules so that we can avoid them, just basically being a tyrant within the market. So,
well, I mean, there's plenty of examples where utility companies have been caught up, price gouging and doing all these things that are allegedly supposed to be prevented under this prescribed system. And I believe that the same rules apply when it comes to the U.S. military. I'm curious. I guess I shouldn't be curious. I think I know the answer already. But My vantage point is that private defense or having options for defense would be a far superior system. It would allow for us to both cut costs and also have more efficient defense for the nation. Your belief is that the monopolistic practices that we've utilized to get to where we are today are in fact not only the only option but the better one?
Well, I think we're talking about the military, we need to look at it from two levels. I think there's the actual military in terms of the standing armed forces, and then there's also the military production side of things, which is, oftentimes you'll have private companies and everything. On the side of the standing army, the Navy, etc., that has to be a nationalized thing. That has to be a state thing, because, this is something that Machiavelli talked about hundreds of years ago. He said, if you rely on mercenaries, and he was going off of the experience of Italian city-states, if you rely on mercenaries in times of peace, they're going to charge more than soldiers normally would, because soldiers, you don't have to pay them as much as mercenaries. But then in wartime, who's to stop the French from just offering your mercenaries more, and then they come over and kill you? And so I think that mercenaries,
because it's their homeland, brother. You think that mercenaries that are in America would turn against their people just because someone offers them a pay raise?
Absolutely. I think that if we get rid of the sense of patriotism and whatnot, and we just surrender to nihilism and relativism, there's nothing to stop people from just going and working for the Russians or something. We see that right now. We see people leave America, like Peter Lavelle did, and go and work at Russia Today and do propaganda for Putin. And yet he got everything, his education, everything from America, and he went and worked for the Russians. And
I'm talking about a war of defense, though, man. You're talking about an invasion from another power. Do you think that people would turn against their family, their neighbors, and just allow themselves to be conquered because someone offers them a pay bump? It's surprising. I would, as someone would you describe yourself as a nationalist?
That's a little bit of a tricky one. In general, yes, but I'm not a nationalist in the sense that I think that everybody in every country in the world should be nationalists for their country. I'm a Western exceptionalist. I think that Western countries, nationalism is good. In Russia, nationalism is bad. North Korea, nationalism.
If America is good,
yeah,
why do you think so lowly of the American people? That they would be traitors. I mean, genuinely traitors in the most technical sense.
Because right now, and it's not the American people, I'm just talking about freak cases. I'm talking about, particular military contractors, that kind of thing. Because we've got a society, we've got a culture that doesn't really have pride in the nation and whatnot anymore. And I think it's very clear, and it's very evident throughout history, that mercenaries would oftentimes betray their initial patrons and go and take contracts from other patrons, and that they don't really have allegiance in the same sense. But even if we ignore that, even if we just say that that's not an issue, it's also clear that they don't have the same ethical conduct and rules of engagement as the standing forces, yet they can make your country look bad. An example of this is Blackwater. People talk about war crimes that America did in Iraq, and they'll point at Blackwater. But Blackwater is not the United States military. They did war crimes, and yet America gets blamed for it, but they were not the American military. And I think that they're a PR nightmare. If I were in charge, I would just ban private military contractors in that sense, and have, you can make weapons for the military and be private, but the military needs to be a fully state operation.
I have to point out that every example you utilized there was wars of aggression. So if you're going to have mercenaries, yes, they might turn sides to get a pay raise when they're attacking some other nation. But I'm not familiar, or I'm not aware of any historical examples where mercenaries turned against their nation and took a pay raise. I mean, let me take that back. I'm sure there are some examples, but in the grand scope of things, I think it's very pessimistic to believe that an American, militia or mercenaries, if you want to call them that, would turn against their own people as they are being invaded by a foreign power.
Militias are different. A lot of the libertarian militias and stuff that train for an invasion and stuff, and they volunteer out of their own time to protect their communities and stuff. I don't think they would. Okay. Blackwater and these kinds of guys, I just don't trust them. They've demonstrated that they don't really have much of a moral compass or anything. People that form neighborhood watches and that kind of stuff and everything, they're not in the business of making a profit. They're actually in the business of defending their country. So sure. I think that there's a difference to be made there. I wouldn't, and I wouldn't mean to try to besmirch the reputation of militias in America based on what Blackwater's done. I don't consider them.
No, they're certainly not comparable.
Yeah.
Okay, and let's get into this, because I think this is a really important one. Since you have described yourself as an American exceptionalist or a nationalist of some scope, I have deep concerns about the fiscal conditions of this country, and I'm curious, given that our national debt is at 28 trillion. Now it'll be 35 trillion probably by the end of this year. We have 100+ trillion in unfunded liabilities. My belief is that your support for empire has ultimately been largely the reason that we are on this path. And I find it curious that neocons tend to believe that they can continue in this path without ramifications or without losing this single global hegemon which you believe in. So how do you balance this with not bankrupting the nation?
Okay. Well, I'm a bit different from most neocons in this, that in an ideal society, I want to abolish debt. I want to abolish public debt. I want to abolish all that. Everything has to be funded with cash. And I'd set up a sovereign wealth fund, that kind of thing, ideally. Now, recognizing the fact of the matter that, yeah, the United States has a lot of debt. The first thing is, I'd say all debt that's owed to China, not going to be recognized, not going to be paid back, because we don't recognize the legitimacy of these communist thugs. And after all the damage and murder that they perpetrated with their virus, we're not even, but we're not paying you back. That's what I would say there. So that gets rid of some of the debt. I would basically say anything has to be funded, 100%. We can't borrow money anymore. That's one thing that I would do, for example. I personally regard the debt crisis as a national security issue, honestly, but I don't regard, you mentioned the empire. I don't consider America an empire. I consider America to be basically an economic hegemon on the world level, but they're not an empire. If they're an empire, where are their colonies? Because throughout history, empires, what they would do is they would go and take colonies, and then they would take the resources of those colonies and bring them back to the motherland and stuff. Where's America doing that? Where's America,
where's America taking resources back?
Yeah, where's America lording over colonies and stealing people's resources?
Well, it tends to be that they any place that we've taken over and conquered, Iraq would be a good example, would it not?
Iraq, well, Iraq's an independent country. Like when you get oil from Iraq, for example, Iraqi companies and the government get that money. That's not like an American territory.
I see your point. Well, then I would argue that our empire is more modeled in the sense of a kind of a fascist empire, and that we use our military to go and invade other nations, and then we give the contracts to pull the resources from the ground from these to private companies in America for the most part. So it's kind of a hybrid empire. So in that regard, I would agree with you. It's not your standard empire where you actually have a colony, but I wouldn't describe it as holistically as you did.
Well, I wouldn't describe it as even a hybrid empire in that sense, because yes, there are private companies that operate in Iraq. You can look at, for example, U.S. oil companies and everything. They're there to be, because the domestic oil sector doesn't have the tech know-how. They don't have the money that the big American companies do. And they go in, and the American companies get a share of the profits, and the Iraqi people get a share of it. And so if it was an empire, all that money would be basically getting sucked from Iraq and going to America, whereas in this case, some companies get money and a profit for helping out, basically helping out build up the infrastructure there. So obviously Exxon's got to make money. And then the Iraqi people get a ton of money. Whereas before, all their money went to fund Saddam's luxurious lifestyle and his Mercedes and stuff. So the Iraqi people have way more ownership now than they did when they were enslaved by Saddam Hussein, for example. So I don't regard it as an empire. These are operations of liberation. They're not operations of imperial conquest. So,
well, I mean, we now have companies that are basically profiting off of our militarism. I'm surprised that doesn't bother you more. It seems to me that if you intend to see your dream to fruition, it's going to be, almost obligatory that you become that you start to take resources from these countries as you conquer them, because my belief is a strong one that our economy is not long for this earth, given how profligate we've been at spending and how unbelievably ridiculous we've been with printing and borrowing. So how
Well,
do you actually get? I mean, other than writing off the debt to China, which would almost certainly be an act of war at this point, what else would you do to try and keep this from all falling apart?
Okay, well, so you could call it an act of war. I don't believe that China would nuke America over that. They would lose. They know that America can wipe them out in 45 minutes, and they can't do the same. They would just have to cry in the corner about it. I don't recognize.
Then why not write off all the debt to every nation? I mean, if we're the big bad boy on the block, why not just tell everybody to shove it?
Well, technically, you could do that and probably get away with it. I do argue, though, like, for example, I'm against student loans, for example, but I don't think that you should write off student debt. People borrow the money, they have to pay it back. But I'm against debt in just on the whole. I don't like usury. But I would say that that on the whole, you do borrow the money, you do have to pay back your creditors, but you can also recognize that borrowing money is dumb. And so for me, I believe that we need to get to a point where everything that the government does is, it's solvent, it's funded on a cash basis, basically through tax money, and you have a sovereign wealth fund in case of an emergency like a pandemic or something, so that you can fund operations for a year even if you're losing money that time. That's a smart place to be in.
All of this is nice in theory, but we're nowhere near that. We're 28 trillion in debt right now. So what is your plan to fix this from here?
Yeah. So the plan to fix it from here, if I was in charge, no more money gets paid to China or anything. We end the welfare state immediately, end Social Security, all that kind of stuff. Social Security is a huge burden there. Obviously, make the healthcare system more efficient, get the government into most aspects of healthcare, and move towards a negative income tax. Now, negative income tax is still going to cost money, but it's not going to cost anywhere near what all this bureaucracy does. And understand that the primary existence of the government is for regulating to prevent externalities, for doing police, for doing firefighting, for basically building roads and stuff, and for the military. None of this huge, vast welfare state type operation. You have negative income tax so that people can spend money the way that they know how they need to spend it. And so
Sure.
If they're in a really dire situation, but it's a safety net. It's not like, oh, I'm going to buy a Lamborghini with negative income tax. It's like, no, if you're on that, it's because you have to, you need that. But that's what I would start with. And you'd see that if you got rid of Social Security, for example, that would actually really change a lot of this discussion, because what's missed is that, yeah, it's a lot of money that America owes. $28 trillion, that's a hell of a lot of money. You get rid of the China stuff, let's just say $22 trillion. The thing is, at that point, that's about 100% of your GDP. That's kind of like somebody who makes $100,000 a year owing $100,000. You can say, oh man, $100,000 of debt, that's not good. But can a guy who makes $100,000 a year pay that off? Yes. It would right?
That's a pretty unfair comparison, given that $100,000 income and $20 trillion income are, you're talking about GDP versus tax receipts. And
no, fair enough. I also do believe that you have to, in the short run, raise taxes that specifically with the purpose of paying off existing debt.
Okay.
And I prefer lower taxes, but
just real quick. You said you'd get rid of the welfare state. What about people that have paid into Social Security? I mean, they've paid into it for 30, 40 years. They're entering retirement. And granted, I am actually with you on this. I think that we do need to get away from the welfare state. But I'm saying for the people that have paid in, I think it's almost like breaking contract, a really legitimate contract that they actually paid their half of.
Yeah, you can make the point, you can make a moral argument that since FDR, who I disagree with, but that since FDR with the New Deal, that the American social contract was updated with an understanding that you knew that you'd have money not set aside, but that you'd have money coming to you if you retired with nothing. What I think we need to get to a point is I would require personal finance to be taught in education, like in high school, grade 9, grade 10, grade 11, grade 12, you have to take it. And I would say, no, you get 50%, you get to graduate. No, you actually have to get 70% in that to even be allowed to graduate high school in all those 4 classes. If you don't get 70%, you have to take it again. And because I think that personal finance is more important than learning math or learning English, or, I don't care if Johnny 10th grade knows his Shakespeare. That's probably not going to do him very much unless he wants to be like an English professor, but then he can research that on his own. But knowing how to manage money, I do care that Johnny 10th grade knows how to do that. And so I believe that everybody should have the approach where we all expect that Social Security won't be there for us. But I understand that officially speaking, it would be unfair to tell people, hey, look, we paid into this our whole lives. Now, there is a misconception around it that I think we need to clear up, though, which is that with Social Security in America, with the Canadian pension plan in Canada, it's not set aside with a bank account with your name on it where you get that money when you retire. It's a pay-as-you-go system. So that once that money's gone out each month, there's like it's a pay-as-you-go system. And so you're not actually technically owed anything. So if the Congress decided that they were going to get rid of that, you can make a moral argument that you had that expectation that it would be there, but it's not like they just took your bank account or your savings account or your pension account or something where they had all this money that you paid into for 30 years. No, that money, when you pay into it, it actually goes to people that are on that system right now. It doesn't go into a vault with your name on it. And so in that sense, legally speaking, you could totally do it.
Well, you could.
How this works is that how I would do it is I would grandfather people out. I'd say if you're 10 years away from retirement, you get 80% of what you were expected for until you're dead.
Yeah, and do a phase out. I got it.
You do a phase out, but if you're 18 or 25, you're at zero. Like you need to understand that when you retire, you got to fund that on your own, right? And we need to get to that system. And for people down the road, even 100 years down the road, for whatever reason, they got nothing when they retire. Well, now they're on the negative income tax because we're not just going to let people die in the streets.
Okay.
But we need to get away from this stupid Social Security. And this is true in Canada too, because it's a similar percentage of GDP in Canada and the US, and we simply can't afford this shit. So
I would make the same argument for the military state, but regardless, I wanted to pivot to, you and Keith obviously talked a hell of a lot more about the wars.
Yeah.
And you pushed back against kind of our ideology, stating that you thought that it would lead to all sorts of hypothetical violence and unknowable lost lives. But from our vantage point, there are hundreds of thousands of children that have been torn, limb from limb, incinerated, starved, diseased from our behavior. And I'm curious, do you lose any sleep over that? Does it bother you at all? Do you think that it's all because you have the best interests for their nation in mind, it's all excused? Because from my vantage point, it simply isn't.
Well, I think we need to get into a bit of specifics there. So you mentioned hundreds of thousands of people. So are you talking like since America was formed? Because America has actually killed millions of people in wars since 1776. But
no, I'm speaking strictly about the Middle East over the past 20 years or 30.
Well, hundreds of thousands is a gross overstatement. In Iraq, for example, about 20,000 people were killed as a result of the actual Western coalition action that was there. They died, and most of that was either enemy combatants or collateral damage. Now, the hundreds of thousands that gets touted out when people talk about how 200,000 people died in the Iraq War, what they miss is that the vast majority of those people were killed as a result of the Iranian-sponsored insurgency. And so I'm obviously against Iran. I've said it before that my main criticism of Bush is that he didn't invade Iran in 2003 because they wouldn't have been able to meddle in Iraq if the Ayatollah regime had been toppled. So for me, in terms of losing sleep over it, what I lose sleep over is how we're not doing anything about Syria right now, how we're going to give up on Afghanistan, how all these people basically died for nothing because Obama and Trump basically could not stay the course. That's what I lose sleep over.
Real quick, you spoke pretty highly of Saudi Arabia, and Keith, in my view, made a huge mistake not bringing up Yemen. Are you familiar with what's occurring in Yemen?
Yeah, so Iran's sponsored a Houthi rebellion against the legitimate government of Hadi there that has brought the country into absolute turmoil. And what Saudi Arabia is doing is trying to repel the Houthi scourge. So
by starving children. I mean, that's the nation that you're supporting.
Saudi Arabia, I need a citation that Saudi Arabia is specifically trying to starve kids. No, they're targeting the Houthis. Now, are they the most accurate? No. I've got a lot of criticisms with Saudi Arabia's military strategy because they don't really 100% know what they're doing. They have really expensive equipment, but the West has not done anywhere near enough to actually train them on how to use this shit properly. I've seen video of them where they bring out tanks and stuff, and then the tanks get blown up by a $10,000 RPG from the Houthis, and you're like, why the hell wasn't that thing guarded with infantry and whatnot and all this kind of stuff? Like they don't have the experience that the US military has, for example, or the Canadian military. And I wish that we could have done more to train them properly. They also don't always hit the right target 100% of the time. But in terms of what they're doing, I mean, there's never been a war that didn't have collateral damage. Collateral damage happens. It doesn't mean you don't do the war, but you do everything possible to minimize collateral damage. It's why I prefer drones to carpet bombing, for example.
But why do you support war at all, given that it is inevitable that children will be lit on fire? Like it's hard for me to understand how someone can have such moral certitude that they can overlook the loss of lives of innocent kids. I don't understand it. I'll never understand it, to be honest, but I would like to understand, at least from your vantage point, how you can feel okay supporting Saudi Arabia, who is embargoing and blowing up aid shipments to these people and having their kids die just because they can't get any fucking food. And I mean, it's atrocious and it's tragic. If any other country was doing it, we would be invading Saudi Arabia on the behalf of the Yemeni people. If you talk about, you know, doing things for really altruistic type purposes, it's simply not that. I mean, these are helpless. It's like the poorest nation in the Middle East, and we are the American people are supporting their destruction. It's tragic.
Well, Iran, the United States people aren't supporting Iran. Iran is what made Yemen as shitty as it is right now. They had a stable government for the most part under Hadi. They weren't starving. They weren't being burned or anything until Iran did what they did. And this seems like victim blaming to now go after the people that are trying to restore order there. Saudi Arabia did not ask for Iran to come in.
I am blaming the people that are starving children, man. Like
So
if that's victim blaming, I'm blaming whoever the fuck's involved. I don't want children to starve. It's not just Iran, man. Come on, it's being embargoed by Saudi Arabia with America's support. You can't put it all. You can't have like good team, bad team. This is a proxy war, and there are innocent children dying because of your support. I'm sorry, but that's not okay.
Innocent kids died in Vietnam too. Does that mean that America? Does that mean that America shouldn't have helped South Vietnam repel the Soviet invasion? I mean, like,
no, I wouldn't have.
So you would have let the world fall to communism then?
Because of Vietnam, the entire world would have fallen to communism.
Well, if you took that stance everywhere, you wouldn't have helped the Contras in Nicaragua. You wouldn't have helped Pinochet in Chile. You wouldn't have helped. So you would have let the world fall to communism. Okay.
Well, so is it the world? I mean, you still have the United States. You still have every other nation that believes in, you know, Western free ideology that would have defended themselves. Do you honestly believe that Vietnam and Nicaragua leads to everywhere being communist?
Well, after Nicaragua, then they go to Guatemala and so on and so forth. It's a domino effect, right? That's what Truman warned about in the early days of the Cold War.
But people are responsible for defending their own freedoms. I think it's extraordinarily paternalistic and completely psychotically utopic to believe that America can prevent all evils across the globe. You're going to bankrupt this country if you continue on this path. I assure you of that. There is no amount of fiscal sanity that you can apply to our budget at home. And you know, removing Social Security, if you're going to try and police the entire world forever and mold it into your image, it's simply unsustainable. You will absolutely bankrupt this country if you continue on this path. I have no doubt in my mind.
The U.S. is the most productive economy in world history, and moreover, I think that there are a lot of economic reforms that you can make to reduce the debt that exists on the domestic front. However, there's never been any sort of empire, historically speaking, or any. I don't consider America an empire, but if we just say America is an empire, America would then be the first empire in history that said, yes, other nations throughout the world and throughout history would have killed to be in our position, but we're voluntarily going to give up our superpower hegemon status that anybody else would kill and envy over and do anything to be us because it costs a little bit of money, bro. I don't regard that as
it ain't a little bit, brother. It ain't a little bit. That's such an understatement. It's unbelievable.
% of the economy, right?
It's what?
2.5% of GDP gets spent on the military. Most of that is on maintenance, not even
if you don't include all of the knock-on effects, if you don't include the care for the troops that come home missing limbs. I mean, honestly, I don't understand why any neocon exists that isn't enlisted. So I would like to ask you that.
When am I joining the military, though? I've done 2 videos on this. So what I'll say is, if you go and check out my video, when are you joining the military, though? I did an updated version, which is a lot shorter. It's only like less than 10 minutes long. The old one was like 20 minutes and had bad audio quality. I go over all of that. But basically, I'll just give you a quick one right here. If I was in the military, you'd say I was a war criminal. If I'm not in the military, you'll say I'm a coward. So I'm not going to join.
No, I'm not calling you a coward. I'm saying that you're supporting things that you're not willing to risk your life for. You know, whether or not that makes you a coward, that's your own cross to bear. I don't know. But I think that it's very odd that these people that believe, as you do, that you have moral superiority and you have the right to implement your will across the fucking planet, that you should actually risk something to do that. And it's not enough to just say, oh, well, I'm going to pay taxes and so now all these young poor kids get to go die in the Middle East for my belief system. I think that it is morally incumbent upon you, who talks about moral degeneracy, to actually risk something and go do it yourself. And I'm not saying that you have to do that. I'm saying that you might want to reflect on the fact that your belief system damaged people. There are American troops that are killing themselves all day, every day, because of the tragedies that they had to participate in based off of your policies. It's heartbreaking. These are fucking good people, man, and they die at their own hand following with your line of reasoning and your line of alleged morality. And I think it's really, really evil for neocons to sit there on the sideline and say, I think that we are the right and the good, and I will allow anyone that's not me to go die on behalf of my belief system. And I think it's really tragic.
So how does me joining either the Canadian Army right now or the American Army in, say, 5 or 10 years, how does me doing that automatically mean that we're going to liberate North Korea? Like, obviously, I'm here to change the political culture. If the political cultures change so that no matter who wins, we're going to have an interventionist foreign policy, I've said before, then I would at that point enlist in the military. But I need to be here on media, on social media, because I can do more here. Because even the best soldier in the world in America is powerless if Trump pulls them out of Syria. So we need to change the political culture first.
Do you care that the majority of troops want to end the wars?
That's not true. No. The military are the most hawkish people. Like, average soldiers are way more hawkish than typical foreign policy hawks. Like,
well, I can send you the polls after we finish here, but it is the majority of troops that want to get out of the Middle East. And I think that it's really odd when people who are so militaristic, so supportive of imperialist forces or whatever you want to call it, that you don't take into consideration the unbelievable emotional and mental toll that it puts on these foot soldiers that go out there and risk everything off your belief system. I want to bring them home. I want to have a sustainable nation, if you want to call it that, or just a fucking landmass with people that have similar ideology to me. But I am sick of seeing these people die, and I'm sick of seeing them come back and have PTSD and shake and not be able to sleep and be homeless. And it's like, all of this is a product of the belief system that you hold, and you do it with an air of moral superiority, which I simply cannot wrap my head around. These people are falling apart because of the things that you have supported, and there's children starving because of the things that you've supported, and you still have certitude. I just hope you reflect a little bit, just a little bit on the human cost to the belief system that you propagate.
So, Clint, you talked about earlier how somebody who gets addicted to drugs has the liberty to make that choice. Do you believe that the people who enlisted in the military or became officers in the military, did they make a voluntary economic decision that they were going to be paid? So then should they be paid to sit around and do nothing? Like, they knew what they were getting into. They're the toughest people in the world. I mean,
they start out that way, and then they come back as alcoholics with trembling hands and fucking revolvers in them. So for their own lives,
or they come back as McCain and become senators and rich. So
yeah, and propagate more wars. Yes, you're right. Sometimes that does happen. But I wouldn't say that.
I wish more wars, right? So
that's incredible. It's just incredible It's incredible that you can think more wars, that you're literally happy and wishing for more death, whether you think it's just or not.
Well, the wars
It's
happen
death.
no matter what. I'd rather start them on our terms over there than on their terms over here, right? So,
how many times have we been invaded, man?
Well, if you didn't take out the Soviet Union, for example, and bankrupt them and counter them in all those proxy wars, they would have invaded America, guaranteed.
Sincerely
you said before, Clint, that you would still have the Western world and they could defend themselves even if the rest of the world fell to communism. I would argue that if almost all the world was the Soviet Union and you just had America and France and the UK defending themselves, basically, the Soviets would then win that war. Whereas if you're on their border and you're countering them everywhere they try to gain ground, you have the advantage. And so I want to win. I don't want to wait for them to come over here. I want to be a lion. I want to be a hawk. I want to deal with them before it gets that bad. I want to prevent the emergence of rivals, not just deal with them once they're overpowered, you know? So
yeah, I understand your perspective. I just can't get past how easily you get past the loss of human life of your fellow Americans, or if you're going to become an American one day, your fellow Americans. I mean, I'm friends with vets. I know these people well. And,
so am I. So am I.
And do you know any of them that have come back fucked up? I really need to know this.
I know people that are in the military. I know people that have served in the military. One of my friends, for example, Henry, was in the military. He runs American Madhouse. He's pretty hawkish dude, for example.
Do you know any that have come back fucked up?
Not personally. However, you know what you're getting into when you sign up for the job. It's like becoming like a lumberjack or something. And then, you know, you got a 1 in 1,000 chance that you might lose your arm or something. Well, you get paid.
It ain't 1 in 1,000, brother.
You get paid. You get paid for what you're doing. And moreover, you don't necessarily have to even go into combat. You can choose your field, your specialty, that kind of thing. It's an economic arrangement at the end of the day. A lot of people actually join.
But you're preying on the most uneducated, the poorest amongst our population, because those are the people that go over there and risk their lives off your ideology, and they come back and they kill themselves oftentimes. Many a day.
Are you saying that we should have like some socialist welfare state or something? Because I believe in they can
have a job and not be killing fucking people overseas, dude. You and I do it.
McDonald's. Then they could work at McDonald's. Why not work at McDonald's then if you're poor? Like they join the military, right?
Because they're offered better benefits with the military, and it sounds exciting. I'm not saying
that's an economic arrangement. That's a voluntary economic arrangement.
I'm not saying they're slaves. I'm saying it's tragic that they come back and they take their own lives because of the shit they've done over there, and you don't seem to have any consideration for that. Have you considered it at all?
Well, my job as somebody here who talks about international relations, foreign policy, the national interest and everything, is to advocate for the action that will preserve and propagate the West and not result in us being buried by the enemies.
So they're cannon fodder. You're willing to watch them die and not talk about it because it doesn't go along with your mission statement.
So when Russia or China invade America down the road, no U.S. soldiers are going to die in that. Like the war happened.
A war of defense is totally different, man. Come on,
The morality is different. You can say that America would be more justified morally once they come over here. I would argue way more people, though, die when we wait for them to start the war on their terms than right now, where a few thousand people die here, a few thousand people die there, that knew what they were signing up for and everything. My point is, I don't believe in waiting for a threat to actually invade you. I believe in preemptive action to nip them in the bud and minimize suffering in the long run.
Oftentimes that preemptive action creates the very terrorists that you're trying to fight. So I think that
citation.
What's that?
I need a citation on that. Just one example.
One example of blowback?
Well, blowback, we can talk about blowback. Blowback's a meme. Like if you want to talk about the Mujahideen, for example, the Mujahideen was an ally, and yet some people from the Mujahideen went into Pakistan, and Pakistan basically initiated the Taliban. And then some of those people down the road helped Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda obviously killed 3,000 Americans. My question for you, Clint, would be, who's a bigger threat in the 1980s, though? Is it the USSR that has the ability to kill 150 million Americans in 30 minutes? Or is it 20 years down the road, maybe a few thousand Americans die, which is a bigger threat to be dealt with by any means necessary.
What an unbelievable brushing over of the maybe 3,000 Americans die. I mean, you have a very callous view of the loss of life. I just need to say that bluntly. You really do.
You would have risked a nuclear war that would have resulted in 1 million 9/11s, right? Because you wouldn't have bankrupted the USSR as soon as possible. You would have let them do their own thing, and then maybe a nuclear war breaks out, even by accident, if they survive another 20 years, right? So a 1% chance of a nuclear war that kills half of America is better than 100% chance of blowback that kills 3,000 Americans.
It's just as likely that your interventionist policies could lead to a nuclear war. So please don't talk about like, oh, if we went along with your plan, Clint, then we would have had a nuclear war. Your plans are just as likely to lead to all-out war and World War III, if anything. If anything, non-interventionism is far, far superior if you actually care about not getting nuked. So I don't understand this perspective.
Not true, because even if a nuclear war broke out with my policies, it would be one that America would win. Whereas when the war starts on your terms,
no one wins a nuclear war, my friend.
That's not true. Did America win against Japan? America won against Japan.
Do you think that a nuclear war amongst nuclear nations is winnable?
If China has 300 and America has 8,000, yeah, America would win right now. Absolutely.
I'm gonna call that an L either way, because the fucking world is destroyed, man. Like
No, it's not, because a lot of those wouldn't even get off the ground on their end. Some of them would get shot down. Some of them would get through. That's true. America would lose a few assets. That's absolutely true. It would be tragic. However,
it's so callous how you talk about this shit, dude.
America would be able to wipe out Chinese society in 45 minutes. It wouldn't be close. America would win. So I don't get it. So
it's not a matter. Okay, win, sure, win. If you don't consider the millions and millions, and in China's case, billions of lost lives, it's just a very callous perspective. You really look at the world and you don't consider the actual human beings on the ground. And I really hope that if anything I get across to you tonight is that you really consider the actual people that are affected by your policy advocacy. Because
I do. That's why I support intervention, because the people of Iraq and the people of Afghanistan were living in slavery, and now they have a chance at freedom. So,
okay.
And we won. That was a neocon win. I know people like to say, oh, but you guys lost Iraq. We won Iraq. Saddam's dead. Ask him how he's doing. Look at Afghanistan. We would have completely won that too if it weren't for Obama and then later Trump and now Biden. So.
You described the kids at Waco as collateral damage. I'd like to go back to that briefly. Yeah. First off, it was over 30 children that were burnt to death. They were Americans. They were innocent. They were kids. How is it that you can support a state that would do that to somebody?
Well, the cult started the fire, right? Like the cult that was there started the fire. Okay. America.
It's not true, but okay, continue.
Okay, well, America can't tolerate these kinds of cults that have their kids and whatnot, and oftentimes women as hostages. That's unacceptable.
People left right beforehand. So how can you say that they were hostages?
They were indoctrinated and brainwashed, and oftentimes, in the case of the kids, not allowed to leave. And the cult had a death wish, and they acted upon that. I don't see how we can tolerate death cults. Is that something you should have the liberty to do? I don't believe so.
How did they have a death cult? I mean, how do you describe it as a death cult when they were sieged for fucking like 45 days and then lit on fire? How is it that they had the death cult and the military that you support isn't the death cult?
Well, because the American military is legitimate, and in that case was enforcing laws and order, and they were not. Like, I mean, it's like at a fundamental level. To draw an equivalency between a death cult and the United States government is honestly insane. So
I think it's insane to describe 30 Americans lit on fire by their government as collateral damage.
The cult started the fire, so
it's not true.
Well, send me a citation on that, because everything I've seen about it is that the cult was the one that resulted in that kind of loss of life. But like, let's say that in terms of enforcing the law, some innocent people get killed. If you don't enforce the law, then there's no law anywhere now, because that sets bad precedent, and now a lot more people die because you've just set the precedent that it's okay to do what they did, right? And we can't tolerate that, and that needs to be put down.
Well, mission accomplished, buddy. 30 kids lit on fire.
But you were making the same argument about Yemen, about how kids die in this operation. It's like, yeah, but Iran started the war. It's the same thing about with America. Like when, for example, Japan attacked the United States and the U.S. Nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, kids were literally vaporized in that.
Fucking awful.
So do you believe that America should have retaliated for Pearl Harbor, or just said, well, the kids would die if we did that?
Well, I wouldn't have embargoed Japan to begin with, so I sincerely doubt that we ended up in that position. But had we been attacked and it had been unprovoked, certainly it deserves a response. But I do not believe in nuking civilian populations largely. And I think it's unbelievably fucking despicable to advocate for that.
Wait, no, but are we talking about World War II, or are we talking, because I don't advocate for nuclear war anywhere outside of North Korea. I just want to be clear about that. North Korea is the only case that I believe that it actually would result in a nuclear confrontation. I believe that you can bankrupt Russia with oil, and that you can bankrupt China by cutting them off on trade. I'm not advocating for a nuclear war with Russia.
You just asked me about Japan.
Okay, but you're arguing that Hiroshima and Nagasaki shouldn't have been nuked. We should have invaded and had 1 million people die. The mainland.
Well, they offered to concede prior, so I don't understand this argument at all, that it was necessary, much less that there was fucking days in between the two nukes, that you had to send the message with the second one. I think if you want to argue that there could have been a nuke used to prevent a land invasion, if you want to go down that line of historical thought, which I actually disagree with, but I'll just play this game, I do not see any justification for the second nuke. And I heard you during the podcast last week say that you would have probably nuked them more. Did I hear that right?
Well, America didn't have the means to do it. America did not have the means. They only had 2 nukes available.
I understand. I'm asking what you would have done.
Yeah, so Japan didn't know that America only had 2 nuclear devices at the ready at that time. It is a historical fact that after the nuclear bombing of Nagasaki, the second nuclear attack, that the military leadership around the emperor was still split on if they should surrender or not after 2 nukes. And of course, they did come to the conclusion to surrender, and they thought America didn't have more, and they were still unsure as to whether they should surrender to America. So this idea that, oh, they couldn't wait to surrender and that Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't necessary. No, they were straight up, the consensus in the military before Hiroshima was, if they invade, they're going to deal with a hedgehog where all the women and children are going to sacrifice themselves against the Americans, and we're going to survive on. And then after Hiroshima, they were still pretty steadfast on that. And then after Nagasaki, they realized America might have hundreds of these things or something. And then at that point, half of the leadership was still, no, we have honor. We have to keep fighting on. And then they eventually came around the conclusion to surrender. This is just, it's fake news, honestly, to say that they wanted to surrender beforehand. That's a Noam Chomsky fake news talking point. So
okay, well, I would just like to I guess end with, I think that it's tragic when you nuke largely civilian territories, no matter the state of the war. I think it's fucking evil. I think it's really tragic when you overlook the fact that we've embargoed multiple Middle Eastern countries and caused the starvation of children to try and get the people to revolt against their leadership, which is what you continue to advocate for today in Yemen. And there are children starving, and it's just not okay, man.
Not in Yemen. The people that overthrew Hadi were Iranian Houthis. That wasn't Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia supported Hadi. This idea that
Saudi Arabia is embargoing them right now. So
no, that's because Hadi's not in charge anymore. The Houthis took over. That's a different regime.
Okay, who is embargoing Yemen right now, though?
Well, at the moment, Yemen, as we would think of it as Yemen, is obviously in a civil war. But the regime with the Houthis and whatnot that Iran's got, that they've taken over, basically, they are not a legitimate state. They're an enemy. They're the ones who started it, and they need to be destroyed.
My point is when you describe someone as an enemy and then you allow children to starve in mass because they are the enemy, it's not, you don't have the moral high ground when children are starving based off of policies that you support. Point blank. There are children, tens of thousands, dying right now because of policies you support. And it's just not okay.
Iran. No, but Iran started the war. Okay. So kids are on Iran's conscience. They're not on mine.
Okay, well, then what about America with Iraq when they embargoed them and they had kids dying from starvation then? Is that okay?
I was against that. I think that America should have invaded Iraq way before that embargo. So
we did it. We found one thing that you don't support when it comes to militarism. That's tremendous.
That's not militarism. Sanctions are not militarism. I oppose sanctions in almost every case because they make war seem like, oh, we did something. We don't need to do war anymore. It's like, no.
You oppose sanctions because it's not enough?
Well, no, it's counterproductive. You hurt the people on the ground. You hurt the regime last. So like on Iran, we're sanctioning Iran. It's like, how is that going to stop them getting nukes? The people suffer. I support war with Iran. I hate sanctions because it's like playing a video game and you level up in the video game. I love video games, but you didn't actually really accomplish anything unless you're like a professional streamer. It gives you a false sense of accomplishment. Likewise, sanctions make politicians feel like, ooh, we did something good, and they can virtue signal about it because they don't have like people that are going to blame them for a death toll or something, whereas all that you're doing is prolonging an inevitable war. Likewise with Hitler and so on and so forth. It's like, which actually results in way more people dying because now they're stronger once the war starts.
I just want to note that in your entire opposition to embargoes or trade sanctions, you didn't once mention the death of the kids there as the reason that you're opposed to it.
On the ground. No, I straight up said that sanctions hurt the people on the ground first and the regime last. They obviously included in that is sometimes kids will starve.
Okay.
That happened in Iraq. That happened. Now it's overplayed the extent to which it happened in the United States or in Iraq rather between the wars, but it's very clear. Like I'm not a fan of George H.W. Bush, for example. I regard him as weak and feckless. He didn't finish the job. It took his son to finish the job, for example. That should have happened in 1991.
In your lifetime, who was the best president? I'm just curious.
Oh, George W. Bush.
Okay.
What about you? Who would you say?
Fuck, dude. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe Trump. He didn't start any new wars, so I don't know.
What do you think about his killing of Soleimani, for example, or his tough talk on Iran? Do you?
Yeah, no. He did a bunch of shit that I hated. I'm just saying he didn't start any major new wars, but he certainly continued with them. I think maybe Reagan, because in his first year of presidency, at least I've read this, I don't know if it's true, but allegedly in his first year of presidency, he refused to learn how to use the nuclear football because he said that he would never retaliate with nukes. And I think that's the most noble thing I've ever heard any president say. You would strongly disagree with that, I have no doubt. But I think that there needs to be a more humane outlook when it comes to militarism and coexisting on this planet with people. And I'm not trying to be all hippy dippy, but I really do believe that your perspective is one that leads to far more death and destruction than is necessary to survive together. And I really do hope that someday you reflect on the amount of casualties that are left in your wake or your ideological wake, because it's tragic. And I really hope you meet some soldiers that have PTSD and understand the true human, ramifications of the stuff that you support.
You can point to the death toll. Say, for example, about 20,000 Iraqis, people in Iraq were killed as a result of Western coalition forces. Most of that was collateral damage. You can look at that and say, well, those people are in your conscience, without realizing that if we let Saddam stay in power for another 20 years, dude killed 1.5 million people. He would have killed 15 times as many people. So it's the same with nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah, a couple 100,000 Japanese people died, but now you just saved 1 million American lives. It's like, instead of saying, look at those dead people, you can say, look at all these people that are alive now that would have been butchered had you not done what you did. That's how I look at it. So I understand that's how you look at it, but those are hypothetical deaths versus real ones. Like these people had names, they had parents, they're dead. They're dead right now, And there are people alive right now that have names that would have been killed by Saddam Hussein.
You don't, and you can't know that.
I can know that,
but I do know the people that are dead because of your belief system. So, you can decide hypothetical versus actually dead. I'm going to side with the dead people.
I can extrapolate based on his behavior of starting wars for oil, gassing his own people, etc., that he wouldn't have become a nice Democrat in 2004. I
would hope not. I hate Democrats, but anyways.
I mean Democrat in the sense of
I'm kidding.
I know. I support the Republicans, but in general, I would say on this whole matter that when we're talking about warfare and everything, I would say you mentioned Reagan, for example, and it was actually up until 1983. It wasn't until you saw the film The Day After that he changed his mind about nuclear weapons, because before that he kind of considered them kind of like a conventional thing. He didn't know that much about them, and then afterwards he got like kind of scared and he started actually practicing with football and everything. I am of the view, like, I like Ronald Reagan, but he was an actor, and I'm of the view that if you don't have the stomach to know that you would retaliate if you were attacked, that you can do literally any other job. You could be an athlete, you could be an architect, you could be anything. Just don't run for president if you're going to do what, say, Elizabeth Warren did, where she said that she would not do a first strike with nukes. She said that publicly. And my view is, if you say that publicly, that signals to your enemies that you probably also wouldn't retaliate if they attacked you first. So that makes a nuclear war more likely, because it means you don't have the heart. And so my view is, even if you personally don't have the heart to use nukes, and I personally believe that a lot of American presidents wouldn't have actually done it. They wouldn't have actually had the heart to do it. But they didn't tell the enemy that. They didn't tell the world that, because you want to project strength so that you don't have to actually retaliate with nukes or be in that position. So for me,
under mutually assured destruction, you have to.
Let's say, like, I could never in a million years use a nuclear weapon, but I know I'm about to be the leader of a country. I would straight up say, oh, if you do anything to us, we'll nuke you, bro. Because that way you don't have to be in that situation.
Yeah, you have to bluff it. I understand the game theory behind that, but I struggle to imagine you struggling with using nukes. Are you implying that you would have a hard time doing it yourself?
Well, no. If you attack me with nukes, you're getting retaliated against. Okay. Right?
But I mean, first strike nukes.
Against North Korea, I've advocated for that. You can check out my debate with Dylan Burns, for example. We had about a 2-hour debate on first strike against North Korea.
How do you free the enslaved that you allegedly care about in North Korea by turning them into glass?
Well, it's a bit late for that. It's about saving ourselves. They're building up thousands of nukes over the next 30 years to use against us.
So all of the enslaved there are simple collateral damage to you?
The time for humanitarian intervention has long passed, dude. Like, you're not liberating North Korea. They've had a policy on the books for a long time. The second the Americans cross the parallel, they execute all the people in the concentration camps. You're not liberating anybody. This is about saving ourselves, honestly. So,
okay.
And again, I would have said to Bill Clinton, go in there, don't nuke them, and liberate the country. Can you say that now when they got 100 nukes? No, that's going to be a nuclear war, and people are going to die. But if you ask me, would I rather live in North Korea my whole life and live in terror or be starved to death, all this kind of stuff, or die in a nuclear bomb? I take the nuclear bomb personally. So that's just me. So,
well, it ain't just you. It's actually a couple million people that aren't you that you're advocating for the complete annihilation of. But
they don't have the right to threaten us with nuclear weapons. It's not going to be tolerated. And this nuclear blackmail that they're conducting, that they're going to conduct, I know what they're up to. They're building up a magic number of nukes when they feel confident that they can say to America, we'll nuke you unless you take your stuff out of South Korea, and we're going to take South Korea now. And even if John Bolton's president then, what would John Bolton say? Well, I would have bombed these guys back in the day, but I'm not going to lose all my cities to save South Korea. And then they cuck America, and America goes from being a world superpower to basically being nothing. And immediately NATO falls apart because people realize that American defense doesn't mean anything. And now Russia, China, North Korea basically have all of Eurasia. And then 30 years down the road, when they come for America, you've got one lonely, irrelevant country fighting off against the world. It's probably not going to work out too well. So for me, it's very clear, if you're going to pursue nuclear weapons, that you're going to be dealt with. And specifically in the case of North Korea, it's not just, it's like a show of force or whatever. Guaranteed, any invasion at this point necessitates them using nukes. I'd rather take their shit out before they use it. It's in a nuclear war, you're better off to fire first than be hit. That's just a fact. And anybody that seriously studied nuclear strategy is aware of that. So Dylan Burns hadn't, even though that's what he does, his foreign policy as a job, but
this entire attitude of treating countries that are pursuing nukes as, basically anytime that you go and you topple some nation that's pursuing nukes, all you do is speed up the other nations that were kind of on the fence, but also quote unquote our enemies by your worldview. It drives them all to try and seek out nukes. So this entire mentality, do you not see it as leading to further nuclearization amongst these alleged enemy
The only other one that you could point to right now is Iran, but they were trying to get nukes for decades, honestly. Like at least 20 years they've been on the record about their nuclear ambitions. So
you honestly believe if they were trying to, I mean, nuclear ambitions, but they've always claimed it was for power. If they were trying to get nukes,
they claimed it was for power to us.
Hold on. If they were claiming that they were pursuing nukes, do you honestly think after decades that they wouldn't have them?
Well, they're poor and they had to keep it under the radar. And it takes a long time for a country to build up nuclear weapons that doesn't have it yet, because they can't do breeding. They can't do any of this sort of stuff with existing materials. They have to do it all from scratch. And
do you think Iran's more poor than North Korea?
The difference is that Iran still is like integrated in the world economy until recent sanctions and stuff. With North Korea, they had nothing to lose. They were always a pariah state, and they had no hopes of going into, you know, the international community. For them, the nukes were a way to get money, because they can do negotiations and bargaining in exchange for getting stuff and then lie about it, and they admitted to it. Whereas with Iran was always more integrated in the world economy. So for them, they had to be a bit more on the hush-hush about it, and it takes a lot longer. And under the terms of the deal, for example, the JCPOA, they had a 20-year timeline that was permitted for them, whereas obviously they pulled out. Trump pulled out, and I like that. I mean, it's funny how you said that you don't support what Trump did with Soleimani and stuff. I regard that as one of the areas that I agreed with Trump on. I mean, he did some things that I liked, but on the whole, I don't really like Trump. Now, I'm not an Trump. I'm not like most of the neocons that just write him off. I'm like, well, no, I want to give him credit where it's due so that he does more things that I like. But otherwise, he's got no incentive to try to appeal to my side. If we just say, oh, you're irredeemable, it's like, no, he was redeemable. If he did a war with Iran, I would have supported him. So I said before, I would have gone on the train. So
his budgetary nonsense is almost certainly going to put a hitch in your giddy up when it comes to continuing the militaristic hegemonic power that you advocate for. But anyways, brother, it's been 2 hours, and
2 hours, so.
I just wanted to say, Kevin, I do appreciate the time. I genuinely, from my heart, hope that you talk with some veterans that have participated in these wars and haven't come back the same. And I know that you've already written off the fact that they agreed to do it. And I'm not saying that they're slaves, and I'm not saying that they're necessarily victims. They did make that choice. But the human toll that this takes on people that are your countrymen, or will be one day, is really tragic. And I know many of these people. I know some that have lost their lives to their own hand. And I really hope that at some point in your life, you go out of your way, if necessary, to meet some of these people and understand the human toll that comes from these wars that you advocate for, because it's not nearly as clean as it seems to be portrayed when you're talking about it.
I would say to you, I would just say, I would hope at some point you would speak to people that have lived under North Korea, lived under Saddam, knew family that were murdered by Gaddafi, that sort of thing. Anybody who's basically had an experience of oppression under tyranny. That's what I would say. I would advise you to do.
I have. Most of them were embargoed by America, like Cubans, for instance. And also, if I were to talk to any North Koreans, I can advise them that if Kevin Castley was in charge, their entire families that are still stuck in fucking camps would be nuked. But anyways, sorry, I really didn't mean to take a dunk, but it's just true, dude. It's crazy.
Yeah, so that, again, I think it's very clear that non-interventionism not only surrenders the world to and gives up all the gains of everybody that's fought and died to get to where we are. It basically says, we only care about liberty here within our own arbitrary borders, and that we're going to tolerate people being butchered for eternity under these systems, as opposed to doing a short-term cost right now to liberate them for the rest of the time. So that's all I gotta say. But if you got any closing remarks, feel free, and then we can wrap it up.
So. No, if I say anything else, it'll just keep driving us back and forth. So it's been 2 hours. If anyone liked what I had to say, if I've dissuaded any neocons in particular, that would be tremendous. Fucking DM me, let me know. It's at Liberty Lock Pod on Twitter, and Liberty Lockdown on YouTube, Liberty Lockdown Podcast everywhere, Spotify, iTunes. And again, I do appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I think that it'll be revelatory for some people, and for those that just enjoyed the shit show, then you're welcome.
Yeah, a lot of people are just here for blood sports and stuff. So we didn't really have blood sports tonight or anything, but I thought it was an interesting conversation. So
I agree.
Hopefully, you get to see a bit more of like where a neoconservative perspective comes from. So
I did, for sure.
Yeah,
All right, brother. Thank you.
Have a good night.